Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan with Sage Dynamics, and this is the Rugged Suppressors Razor. So I wanted to check out some more 30 cal suppressors, and I'd already had really good experience with the 9mm suppressor from Rugged, the Obsidian, and I wanted to check out one of the 30 cal cans. So I took a look at what they offered, and the Razor just kind of appealed to me based on size and performance and some of the features that went into it, the specifications, if you will. So I went ahead and bought one, got a couple different muzzle devices so I could run it on a couple different guns for the 2,000 round review process. One thing that definitely appealed to me right out the bat is it is a taper mount type system, which I do prefer. Don't get me wrong, there are some great QD ratchet collar type systems out there, but I like the simplicity, and from a lot of cans, and even though I didn't know this getting into it, the return to zero capability of threading the suppressor onto direct thread, if you will, or also threading it onto a threaded muzzle device with the dual taper system. And theirs is kind of foolproof in the fact that it has a go, no-go marking on the muzzle device. So you screw it on and you check to make sure it says go. And if it says go, you can go ahead and, you can lock the collar in. It says go, you're good to go. The collar locking system is a final step of security in the mounting process to keep the can from coming loose. We've got a 17.4 stainless steel body with stellite baffles, and of course, like I said, it is a dual taper mount system which works with their muzzle devices. I purchased 2 flash hiders, which do, as advertised, they do hide the flash. Getting the review process, I was going to be using it on a couple different guns. Obviously, I was going to throw it onto a bolt action, which is my Tikka T3X TAC 1, that very long name. Also using it on my Bren 2 chambered in 7.62 by 39, and of course, you can't have a 30 cal review without putting at least some 300 blackout subsonic and supersonic through the suppressor, so I was going to be using my SIG MCX. So that's 2,000 rounds across 3 calibers getting into the review. As far as features go, like I already talked about, the material, the overall weight, the overall length are very manageable. You definitely don't really notice it any more than you would any other suppressor, with it being on the end of the gun. And of course, mounting is just as simple as screwing it onto the gun. However, I did identify, and it could just be a sample size of 1, an issue getting into it with high rates of fire. Didn't have it happen on the bolt gun, but with high rates of fire on the Bren and high rates of fire on the MCX, I did notice that that collar would occasionally allow the suppressor a little bit of play, a little bit of movement. So I'd shoot, a magazine and check my indexing using their suppressor marking so I could see exactly where the can was without touching it, because that's a bad thing once you got a gun that hot. And I would have to retighten it just a little bit or twist it back and check the collar and then shoot again. And that did happen. Didn't happen with slow fire, didn't happen on the bolt gun at all, but it did happen periodically with the Bren and with the MCX during, a string of like 5 quick rounds, 5 quick rounds, 5 quick rounds running off the shot timer. It was something I noticed. It did not happen on subsonic. It was only that supersonic ammunition in 300 blackout and 7.62 by 39. But getting a good feel for the can, it's got really good sound attenuation for its size. Performance is really good. On 300 blackout subsonic, you're not expecting anything to just suddenly become loud, because subsonic by nature doesn't have the supersonic cracks, so we're already in a much better place for sound attenuation and performance. But it's a really quiet can. Throwing it on the Tikka and shooting some subsonic 308, it is stupid quiet. I think barrel length, obviously in subsonic 308, plays a factor in that, but the suppressor definitely plays a part, and it does it very well. Even when shooting supersonic, which is what I shot for most of the review process, 308, 7.62 by 39, 300 blackout, sound performance, sound attenuation was very good. Even in more confined spaces, I was still getting the good sound performance that I'd want from a suppressor of this size. Bringing us to the Burndown. Whole purpose of the Burndown is 500 rounds as quickly as possible, which is a little unrealistic, I know, to see if I can identify any issues that I wouldn't necessarily notice with 500 rounds over a much longer period of time. So 4 or 5 minutes versus 4 or 5 days, 4 or 5 weeks, 4 or 5 months to cover that same 500 rounds. Here's your Burndown. First to last round of the Burndown went excellent, except the suppressor did that slight unlocking thing. And what I wanted to see is, was that going to affect accuracy? I didn't necessarily notice any accuracy issue, but whenever it did it, it made it harder to remove the suppressor. So I did the 500 round burn down. During that burn down, the can came slightly untimed. It didn't unscrew, it didn't violate the go, no-go gauges, but there's just a little bit of a quarter turn or more movement in the suppressor, and I don't like that. When I screw something on, I want it to stay that way. And having a suppressor come loose, if theoretically it ever came loose even more than that and started to unscrew, you may not notice it in time in order to prevent a baffle strike or, God forbid, a round going through the side of the suppressor and shooting the suppressor downrange in one piece or three pieces. So that did give me a little bit of pause. I didn't have that happen. It did carbon lock a little bit, which I actually think may have helped. But 500 rounds, again, that's a lot of ammunition in a very short period of time, a very unrealistic ammunition for most purposes in a very short period of time. However, Rugged says this is a belt-fed rated suppressor, and while I don't have a 308 or 30 caliber belt-fed, I do have a brand and a whole bunch of magazines, and I put 500 rounds of, admittedly, you know, it's 7.62 by 39, so it's not the highest quality ammunition, very corrosive, so definitely want to clean things out, firearm as soon as possible, but for performance, no issues, except for the fact the suppressor is able to walk itself off when I do shoot a little bit more enthusiastically. During the next 1,000 rounds of the view, I spent quite a bit of time shooting this thing at night, and it's the performance that you'd expect. And it gets boring in that regard, in the fact that the sound attenuation never really seems to change from hot to cold gun. Muzzle flash, that's obviously a concern. This thing's muzzle signature is very reduced, even on a first round pop out of a bolt gun, or as you're shooting like a quick string, 4 or 5 rounds, you build up that gas volume in the suppressor, and then like on the 5th or 6th round, you'll have like a more pronounced muzzle flash. Well, the more pronounced muzzle flash on the Razor isn't really noticeable compared to the regular muzzle flash, and I appreciated that a lot. Return to zero, of course, is a big question because we're not always going to shoot with our suppressor on. We might take it off for some reason and then put it back on, and hopefully the gun returns to zero. With some suppressors, that's not the case. So what I did is I mounted it on my Tikka, zeroed it to the Tikka, with 5-round group at 100 yards, shooting 168 grain Hornady ELD match. No loss of accuracy for the Tikka. That's at sub-MOA accuracy I've come to know and love from my Tikka rifle. Then I removed the suppressor and fired a 5-round group to see how much the zero shifted suppressed versus unsuppressed because the gun is zeroed for the suppressor. So here's that 5-round group, same distance, 100 yards, with 168 grain Hornady ELD match. That's a minimal zero shift. I'm very happy with that. Sometimes the zero shift is more pronounced. I'm still within a 1.5, 2 inch area of point of aim, point of impact from where the gun is zeroed. Of course, finally put the suppressor back on, make sure it's properly mounted, and fire another 5-round group at the same distance using the same ammunition. I'd call that return to zero, which is what I'm looking for. I did fire the rifle more than a few times, unsuppressed, take the suppressor off, using it for various other purposes. And I really think that you could, again, this is a great thing about consistent performance in machining. I really think you could dope for that like you could with some other suppressors. You just memorize like, okay, I know when it's unsuppressed, I gotta, come right, half an MRAD or whatever, and I got to come down like maybe 3/4, 0.5, 0.75, whatever. I really think you could dope for that. Honestly, generally when the suppressor's on there, I just leave it on there. I don't like to shoot unsuppressed unless there's a predominant reason for it. So this wouldn't be an issue that I would necessarily worry about because it probably wouldn't be something I would do. I don't see any reason to shoot the rifle unsuppressed when it has a suppressor. But if it's something that you have a concern about, definitely something that you can take a little bit of peace of mind from is there is a zero shift like there would be with almost any suppressor, but that zero shift is very minimal and it's very repeatable from unsuppressed press, unsuppressed press, unsuppressed press, unsuppressed press, unsuppressed press. Yeah. So final word, how do I feel about the Rugged Razor? I am not as happy with it as I am with the performance of the Obsidian. That being said, it's a great can. It really is. I was just a little aggravated consistently about that slight unlocking issue. And again, can never came completely unlocked. I never had any safety issues. It never started unscrewing itself. I had a couple carbon lock issues, but cans are going to carbon lock. It's going to happen, especially if you shoot them. You know, you shoot 500 rounds in a range visit as it gets dark and temperature changes and condensation and moisture in the air, and then you drive home and you put it in the safe and then you take it out like a day, 2 days later, and you're like, oh, I can't get it off. Let me put it in the vise, or let me heat it up a little bit with this nap gas torch. Whatever you got to do to get the suppressor off of there. So I'm not really worried about the carbon locking. I feel like I needed to mention it because people have asked about it in the past. And one of the concerns that some people have with direct thread, mainly with taper lock, because there's a muzzle device relationship at play, is it going to carbon lock on me really bad? Because some suppressors are famous for not being able to get the suppressor off if you let the gun cool down. And that's not an issue I really experienced. Just had to put a little bit of leverage on it and it came right off. I'm not unhappy with the suppressor. I just wish I was more happy with the overall performance. I think it is a good suppressor, and again, could just be a sample size of 1 with that collar issue. But that gave me enough pause when I was shooting on a semi-auto versus a bolt gun that I wasn't able to really get into what I was trying to do without, kind of becoming paranoid about it. Checking it, tightening it, checking it, tightening it, checking it, okay, it's still tight, checking it, okay, I got to tighten it again, checking it, okay, it's still tight. A little bit aggravating. And hopefully that's just an issue I had with this suppressor, and it's not an issue that's like what we'd call a design feature. That's not something we definitely want. So I'm going to do some digging into that. I looked around, of course, on the internet to see if anyone else was having that problem. And I found a few people that had mentioned it, but it didn't seem to be like an epidemic thing. So from my experience, sample size of 1, but it seems like there are a couple people out there that had a similar issue with theirs. Again, I feel like I have to reiterate, it's not the biggest of deal, but it is definitely something I was concerned with, and something I felt like I had to mention during in the review video. Overall sound performance is amazing. I would like to get this can as a direct thread. I would like to forego their taper mount and their muzzle device system altogether and just be able to direct thread it onto the firearm. That would make me a lot more happy with the overall performance, even though it is still a pretty good can. Just definitely, if you're in the market, consider, this sample size of 1, take it with a grain of salt, as you should. Seek out other opinions and see if other people share the same or similar opinions before you make your purchase. Because, as we know, buying a suppressor, because of the draconian and hegemonic behavior of the ATF, can be a little problematic, and it's definitely a long process. It's not something you can just run in the store and pick up. When a lot of people buy suppressors, it's a big deal because of all the nonsensical paperwork that you have to get through in order to get something that makes your bullets more quiet. So, I like it. I wished I liked it more. If they make a direct thread version, I'm going to be all about it. The overall quality of the suppressor is fantastic. I feel like I have to reiterate that. It just don't really care for their dual taper mount collar interface system. So if I could forego that and get a direct thread or maybe a different type of QD system to check out, I'd be all about it. I'm Eric with Sage Dynamics. Suppress accordingly.